a talk. Thank you. I have a talk with slides and things like that. So I think, Buna, you might have to enable my screen sharing thingy. But I am very happy to forget the stuff I prepared and just talk about what you guys are interested in if you have pressing questions and interesting things to ask and to talk about. I think the plan that I discussed with Abuna, Michael, was that we have a 2-week thing. So there's this week and next week. So I am happy to just talk today. And the talk is just basically an introduction to the field of Orthodox Christian apologetics. I'm happy to do that. But please feel free, unless you guys have something, to kick off with, I'm happy to do that as well. Or as I'm talking, if something comes up and you really want to talk about it, do please let me know and stop me. And if none of those things happen, I hope by the end of today, you will think of lots of really interesting things you want to talk about next week, because I have nothing prepared for next week. I said to her, when I want to, because every group is interested in different things. So I could talk to you about stuff I find interesting, but that might be dead boring to you. So I'd rather us talk about things that, well, I want to be interested in it too, but I'm sure I will be. Okay, so before I start, is there anything like any apologetic-y type questions that anyone would like to raise? And I should tell you what I've learned to do on Zoom now is when I ask a question that could get a response from you guys, I count to 5. And if nobody says anything after 5, then I'll just go on. Alrighty, so I think that was about 6 that time, so we're probably okay. Alrighty, so let's just get started then. Okay, and hopefully you can see my screen now. Alrighty, so defending our faith, this is what we're going to be looking at today. And I don't know if any of you guys have seen a show on television called House. He's the character you see, that handsome face, is a brilliant doctor who diagnoses diseases that other doctors have failed to diagnose. But he's a very cantankerous fellow. And he basically has criticisms of everyone in the world, but among his pet hates are religions, right? So he's an atheist, doesn't believe in any of that mumbo jumbo stuff. So this is an actual quote from one of his episodes. He says, "Rational arguments don't usually work on religious people. Otherwise, there would be no religious people." And he captures a sentiment that is not that uncommon in our society today. And it's probably a growing sentiment. It's this idea that religion makes no sense. It was okay in the childhood of humanity. Maybe we needed it, to ward off our fear of the dark and things like that. But now that we've grown up, surely we can think logically and rationally, and we can dispense with religion. We don't need it anymore. And in fact, the assumption in that quote is that if religious people actually stopped and thought about it and actually approached it logically, then they would realize that religion is just wrong. It's mistaken. So I'm really going to try and spend the rest of the night trying to show you why that's not true. Basically, and I think we have very good reason to think that it's not true. That kind of thinking, as I said, is growing in the world, but nonetheless, it's only growing in selected areas. And mostly it's the richer parts of the world, the wealthier, more well-off parts of the world where religious adherence is forming. But the last time I checked the statistics, and this is a little outdated, couple of years ago, 90% of the population of the world is thought to follow some kind of religion. In Australia, in the last census that's been completed, I believe we're due for one. Oh, we did. We filled it in about a month ago. But the last census for which we actually have results, 2016, for the first time in the history of Australia, the largest single religious group in Australia was no religion. And 2016 was the first year where no religion overtook any Christian denomination. So prior to that, for decades, Church of England, or Anglicanism, was always the biggest group, followed reasonably closely by Catholics. And then about 20 years ago, the Catholics overtook the Anglicans because the Anglican Church has been shrinking quite rapidly. But of course, with all the troubles the Catholics have been having, they've been losing members, unfortunately, and losing ground. And so for the first time in 2016, no religion, 30% of the population put down no religion. Now, Christianity still constitutes a little over half of the Australian population. That's all the different denominations together. And those who put down no religion aren't necessarily atheists. And in fact, a pretty significant proportion of them would come under what some people call the category that is spiritual, but not religious. So basically, they still believe that there is something more to life. And they might believe in, I don't know, supernatural things or angels or, the spirit of the earth or whatever it might be, or fate or those sorts of things. But what's actually happening in countries like Australia is that people are being turned off the institutions of religion much more than they are giving up on spirituality altogether. So that kind of atheist who just thinks that there's nothing in the world other than atoms bouncing around in space, and that's it, and there's nothing else, everything can be reduced to that, is still actually a relatively small minority. And a lot of the people who put down no religion, they just don't want to go to church or any kind of organized religion, but they still believe in something. So this is the world in which we now live and in which our children are going to grow up in. And it's natural that as Christians, we should want to preserve our faith because we believe our faith because we have lived it and we have experienced it. And we don't want our children to be dragged away from something so precious and so beautiful by the kinds of trends that I've just described. But sometimes the way we go about trying to achieve that goal of strengthening our children's faith, strengthening even our own faith or each other's faith, sometimes we don't do it in the best of ways. So I've got a list here on the screen of bad ways of trying to do that. So this is the list that you should not try at home. Please do not try this at home. So sometimes what do? We isolate children from other ways of thinking. Don't read this, don't watch that, don't talk to her, don't go to that place. Now, that may work when they're very little, right? But they're going to grow up and you can't just make them live in a bubble. They're going to go to school, they're going to go to university, they're going to go to work, they're going to come across, particularly if they go to university, they're going to come across weird and wonderful ways of thinking, right? And if they're not prepared to deal with it, they're not going to cope with it very well. So I think one of the worst things we can do, it's like, the parents who don't let their children touch anything or go near anything. And then the kids have no immunity because playing in the dirt and getting the occasional, cold and whatever and sniffle is actually building up their immunity. And if you don't give a child a chance to build up their immunity, then one day when they are exposed to a disease, it's going to be terrible. Another strategy we try and do is just to dictate to the children what to believe. Just say hadir, right? Just obey, just listen. Don't question, don't argue. Just what I'm telling you is true, end of story. And I'm sure any of you who have children will know that that just doesn't work because it's not, that isn't logical, right? That is the kind of approach that people like Dr. House, see, and therefore think that Christians don't think for themselves. right? They're just told what to believe. And it once again, it may have worked 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, but it certainly won't work in the world we live in today, where kids grow up being taught at school how to explore, how to be curious, how to ask questions, and how to do research. And that's a good thing, because we want our kids to learn. We care about the truth, and you get to the truth by looking for it. So rather than just telling them, be quiet and accept what I tell you, I think what we need to do, and I'll talk more about this later, what we need to do is rather person who shouldn't ask any questions is the person who already knows everything perfectly, right? Then they have no need to ask questions. But I don't think that applies to any of us in this world. So we need to grow in our faith, and that's done by asking the questions. And the last one, which is maybe the most benign of all of these, is the art of distraction. And it's solved for today, but the question, look, and for some kids that may be solved forever. Maybe they will. The day will come one day, confident in your faith yourself out, right? There is certainly, please don't take anything I've said to suggest that we should, open our kids' minds to absolutely every possible challenge there is against Christianity, right? I'm not saying that. There is unhealthy doubt, and it can have unhealthy motivations sometimes. I can just be angry with someone at church, or, and therefore I try and find reasons to justify my not going to church or whatever it might be. That's unhealthy doubt, but I don't think we should mix that up with healthy doubt, which is someone who's sincerely and genuinely trying to understand and to deepen their involvement in the church and to deepen their own faith and their relationship with God. So here are some good strategies, I hope, the truth of Christianity. They're two different things. So there's nothing wrong in us being honest with people and saying to them, you know what, that's a really good question. Let's you and I together try and find the answer for it. And, maybe we won't ever find a perfect answer for it, but that's okay. So if I find truth, I am finding God. And that is the conception I think we need to have, as long as we're doing the questioning right. I'm assuming here that we're doing the questioning in an efficient and effective, reading posts on Facebook or it with the real God. Okay, so apologetics then is the art of getting to the truth. And as I said, we need to learn how to do that well. And just to show you, I'm not making this up, it's there in the Bible. And the verse that's usually quoted is 1 Peter 3:15 and 16. Always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. And I'll just point out there that the word defense in English is a translation of the Greek word apologia, from which we get the English word apologetics. So this is, all of that, believe it or not, was just the introduction. So here is the menu for today. The first thing we're going to do is just very quickly define what apologetics is and some broad contours of how we might go about doing it. The second thing is we're actually going to do what Dr. House thinks we can't do. We're going to prove him wrong. And we're going to look at, and I'm just going to give you a very, very brief taste of some of the arguments or reasons, rational foundations for thinking that the Christian faith is true. And then after that, we're going to just look at some practical or pastoral sort of issues, just some issues to do with what it actually, what are the do's and don'ts of talking to someone about apologetic type questions, just some very general, in some very general sort of ways. So the first section here is, what is apologetics? What is it that the apologist aims to achieve? So just a very quick historical background. The word doesn't just come from the Greek language. It actually comes from the ancient Greek legal system, where when there was a case to be tried, the prosecutor would stand up first and deliver a speech of accusation. And this was called a categoria, which literally means an accusation. It literally means to harangue the agora, right? The agora is the place where the city gathers together. And so he speaks to the agora. He speaks according to the gathered people. And then the defense lawyer would stand up to deliver his argument for the defense. And this was a response to the word that the prosecutor had said. So it is literally according to the word, the response to the categoria. And that was called an apologia. So this was the name that was picked up in the early church, and not just by Christians, by the way. So there are Jewish apologies, and we can even go back to Socrates and the apology of Socrates when he was being tried and eventually put to death. But we also find the word being used to describe things said or written by St. Paul, and then, of course, the early Christian apologists, St. Justin Martyr, St. Clement of Alexandria, Origen, so on, who mostly were presenting a defense that had very serious consequences because the pagans often wanted to kill the Christians. So the defense was not just an intellectual exercise for someone like St. Justin Martyr. It was actually a life and death situation. Today, of course, we don't have to worry about someone killing us, thankfully, at least in Australia. And the chief challenge is not from pagans or Jews who already had some sense of divinity, already had some sense of the supernatural, I suppose we could call it. But today, what we are more and more finding ourselves discussing is the modern secular worldview that basically leaves no room for God or even for things like a human soul or free will or, moral good and evil or any of those kinds of things. And there's a kind of apologetics that responds to, say, challenges from Islam or challenges from Buddhism or whatever. But generally, I think nowadays what we're talking about is the atheist challenge. But I actually just want to point out, although I keep using the word apologetics, I actually don't like it very much because, as you have noticed by now, it denotes an adversarial kind of approach, right? In a court case, someone has to win, someone has to lose. In a court case, you're on opposite sides. You're arguing against each other. It's a zero-sum game. But I actually think if we, as Christians, believe that God is truth and that we want to find truth, and if we can respect and appreciate that the person we're talking to, whether it be a child with questions or whether it be an atheist, if we can respect that they are also searching for truth, then we don't need to make it adversarial. We don't need to be against each other. To just give a kind of a physical metaphor for it, we don't need to stand face to face and talk at each other. It's better that we stand shoulder to shoulder and help each other to look for the truth. And that's the model that will very soon be obvious, if it's not already. That's the model that I prefer. And I do know that there are other ways of doing it, and they each have their benefits. It's always a lot of fun to watch a YouTube video where, John Lennox is giving it to Richard Dawkins or whatever. It's fun to watch blood sports. But I'm not sure that it's the best way for us as a general approach to try and understand our own faith and to share the rational foundations with others. So I prefer to use terms like natural theology or Christianity and truth and things like that. But, what's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Okay, I've been talking a bit, so shall I just stop for a second and just ask you guys, would anyone like to ask anything or comment or challenge or say anything at all? And I should have said at the beginning, whenever I do these apologetics talks, there's only one rule. You can say anything you like at all. I promise you, I am utterly unoffendable. It's just impossible. Better people than you have tried and failed. But the one rule is you just have to be courteous. That's it. So I see there's a hand. So Emil, go for it.
Hi, Buna.
Hello.
I put a question in a chat, but I have another question as well. So I thought easier to say it.
Sure.
So I was talking to one of my friends. He's a Greek, and he was saying that before Jesus was born, that were many stories exactly like Jesus, like Horus, and he mentioned a few names. And actually, he has a video showing that there's another 12 stories were born in the same way as Jesus. So he's saying that Jesus could be like the one of these stories. So how can we kind of, like I was saying, we could have take Jesus' story from the old the stories before Jesus.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's a really good question. So I guess he's talking about a virgin birth. Is that what you mean?
Yes. Correct.
Yeah, and that there are virgin births in other cultures even before the time of Jesus and so on.
Yeah.
And why should that surprise us? So, I mean, we believe that Jesus was a human being, but look at all the other human beings who came before Jesus. The only reason Christians think that Jesus was a human being is because of all the other human beings. Yeah, but so what? We believe that Jesus spoke in Hebrew, but all the other people spoke Hebrew before Jesus. Yeah, so what? How does that change anything? The fact that something may have been thought to have occurred in history at different times, the fact that there may have been myths about it, I think, and some people would argue that there is a very important purpose for myths. Myths are the result of when people think very deeply about the nature of reality, and they may have some insights about the nature of reality, and they don't know how to express it, so they express it by making a story. Right? And this is how the human mind has worked for millennia. And even today, a really good movie or a really good television series or a really good novel, even though it's fiction, one of the things that makes it really good is if it somehow represents something deeply true about reality, about the reality of human nature or the reality of good and evil, or something like that. Now, we shouldn't be surprised that all through history, people sought the truth, and that sometimes they found some of it. They were looking as through a glass dimly, right? They didn't see it clearly, because we only see it clearly when God himself comes down and walks the earth and says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And we see it clearly in him. But we shouldn't be surprised that we see it less clearly in other cultures, in other myths, in other stories, that come before that. So, I mean, someone like St. Justin Martyr, for example, he spends a little bit of time in one of his apologies talking about the Greek philosopher Socrates. And he draws all the similarities between Socrates and Jesus. Right? Socrates was killed because he was thought to be an atheist, because he rejected the traditional view of the Greek gods. And he was an innocent man because he actually didn't reject the Greek gods. He just said, you guys are making stuff up about them. And he thought in sublime ways about divinity, and even came up with this idea that there must be at the heart of it all the one, or the good. And this is beyond our understanding. And everything must come from the good, with a capital G kind of thing. Right? And he says, Socrates, he even goes so far to say a very brave thing. He says Socrates was a Christian before Christ, because he lived about 400 years before Jesus. But because Socrates, the Greek pagan philosopher, genuinely sought the truth, he didn't have the benefit of scripture, he didn't have the benefit of Jesus, but in his limited way, he found some truth. And it comes out in his writings, right? And St. Justin Martyr, the Christian, 500 years later, is happy to acknowledge that and to say, see Socrates points to Jesus. And in fact, I think that's how we as Orthodox Christians think about history. We don't just think in that linear way of A follows B follows C follows D. We see Jesus and the incarnation as being the center of history. And we understand and interpret everything else before him, during, and after in the light of Jesus himself. And therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that there are these scattered, misty reflections of Jesus in things past and present. So does that help at all, Emil?
Kind of, I think his point is that we could, like the Bible, just copy the story from these stories. Jesus' story from his birth, because this story was mentioned before Jesus 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So kind of we're creating the story about Jesus, how he born and all this fact.
So look, if I was talking to him, one of the questions I'd want to ask him is, what is your evidence for that? Can you show me that connection? So, historians can actually trace things, right? You can see, for example, like I said, we know that Justin Martyr read the story of Socrates and talked about it, right? We can see that there's a line that connects them. Okay, so we are justified in saying, that Justin Martyr saw Christ in Socrates. What is your evidence for saying that whoever it was, and who do you think is the one who wrote that story about the virgin birth of Jesus? Do you believe it's the apostles? If it's the apostles, can you show me a line that leads from a virgin birth story somewhere else to the stories in the Gospels? Okay, because it's all very easy. There's this whole area, and I don't want to digress too much. There's this whole area called evolutionary psychology, which gives you all of these stories that explain things that human beings do today as evolutionary adaptations, right? So, when we lived in the forest, we had to do this, and that's what made us now behave in this way, because we evolved to do that, right? And sometimes they sound very plausible and they make a lot of sense. But a philosopher about a year ago wrote a very controversial paper that just turned that whole field into turmoil, where she argued very convincingly, and I haven't seen anyone refute her, that there is no evidence, right? When you try to do psychology scientifically, you have to base it on the evidence. And there is simply no evidence. And if you think about it, there can't be evidence because we're talking about adaptations that happened before the advent of writing, before the advent of buildings. We're talking about things that happened, 50,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago. And we're talking about things that are not going to, if you find a stone knife, that doesn't tell you how someone, behaved with his, partner or something like that, right? So, and she makes a really valid point. It's really easy to make up a just so story. Is it Rudyard Kipling, I think, who had these just so stories that just explain something like a fairy tale, that explains why something is, is what it is today. But if your friend is challenging you and that friend has a scientific mindset, then the question you need to ask your friend is, show me the evidence. I want to see the evidence. Otherwise, anyone can say anything.
He mentioned that Horus, for example, this story about Horus is in temple.
But I want to point out, right? Something happened in Egypt.
Yes.
I need to see the line of influence that shows me that influenced people in the first century in Palestine. Because how do I know that happened?
Yep.
Isn't that logical?
Yes.
Look, I can say, all right, let's say, I don't know, I don't want to get too political here. I'm going to do it anyway. Here is like, we had President Donald Trump in America. Okay. And you know what? He sometimes did things that were very similar to Adolf Hitler. So clearly he was copying Adolf Hitler. Okay, now look, I might be able to make a case for that, right? He built up a fanatical base who would be willing to die for him, and he, argued a politics of division, and it's us against them. Okay, that's all stuff that Adolf Hitler did. But is there any evidence that can be traced that he read Mein Kampf or, studied the life of Adolf Hitler or anything like that, right? And you tell me, oh, but his dad was German or his grandfather was German. Sure, but show me the evidence, right? And I don't know, but I doubt very much that Donald Trump, was trying to copy Adolf Hitler. I doubt very much that's the case. You can't have it both ways is the point that I'm saying here, Emil, right? If I want to challenge Christianity because Christians believe in things without evidence, I can't make a case without evidence. That there's a double standard here, or isn't there?
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, and I noticed there is another question here in the chat. I was reading a book about dinosaurs yesterday from my son, and was mentioned in the book that dinosaurs existed about 200 million years ago. Could this be possible? Were the dinosaurs gone before Adam and Eve were created? Also, at the end of the book, they mentioned that after all the dinosaurs were gone, the world was taken over by new animals, mammals, which in the future led to humans like you. Okay, so could this be true? That's probably a whole other topic, I think, to talk about. So if you'll forgive me, I'll just say a very brief comment. But yeah, to do that one justice, I think would take a lot more time. Unless, I'm happy if you want to spend the rest of today, we can talk about it, or even next week or something like that. But the comment that I just want to make is that as Christians, the thing we're interested in is the meaning of life. Who are we? Who is God? How are we to live our lives? And the only point that I want to make is whatever happened in history, whatever way we got here, changes nothing in any of the things that really matter to a Christian. And, we can argue, and Christians have different points of view on this, on evolution and whether it happened or not, and how old is the earth and all of that sort of stuff. All of that is peripheral, as far as I can see, is peripheral to what Christianity is really all about. And the only thing I do want to say with some confidence is if anyone kind of says, you simply cannot be a Christian unless you believe the world was created in 6 24-hour days, 6,500 years ago, if you give up that belief, then you have ceased to be a Christian. I want to argue with that person because no, I don't agree. And even if we go back to the church fathers, we'll see they read the creation accounts in Genesis in lots of different ways. For example, the Cappadocian fathers, St. Basil, St. Gregory, and so on, they basically read the creation narrative and said God created the world in an instant. He just made it happen like that. But all that we're reading about in Genesis is not something spinning out in time. It's just a kind of a poetic description of the order and the wisdom of God and how he made everything work together. But anyway, I won't say any more at this stage. Is that okay, or did you want to sort of ask a follow-up on that?
No, thank you. I want to thank you so much for that.
Okay. So any other thoughts before we proceed?
Abuna, a question came in anonymously. I'll just read it out. The person says, even after studying and learning theology and believing in God, we sometimes get panics and worries that maybe we are mistaken. And when we die, we might find out that we were wrong and miss out on heaven and we were wrong. I'm sure these are temptations of the devil and they're meant to shake us, but what is a quick way to silence these worries?
I don't have a quick way, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. I wish there was like a, you could go and get vaccinated or something. Look, what you're describing is the journey of faith. And I don't think we're meant to take shortcuts in a sense. Look, I'm happy to confess in front of you all. I have moments of doubt sometimes. And over the years, I've had those moments of doubt. And what's happened over the years is I'd made that decision to say, if God is the truth, I want to find the truth. I don't want to believe in a God that isn't really God. Or if there is no God, I don't want to believe in someone that doesn't exist. What I can say to you is, after doing this for many, many years now and trying to do it as honestly as I can, in an as unbiased a way as I can. And of course, I'm not completely unbiased. Of course, you know, I have leanings, obviously, but I have tried as honestly as I can to consider all points of view and weigh them up as fairly as possible. I am convinced today more than I have at any time in my life of the reality of the God that we believe in Christianity. And so look, the answer to the question is, I think what you need to do is trust that the God of truth will lead any person who sincerely searches for truth, will lead him to that truth. And that truth is the God that we believe in. That's how we define our God. He is the God who is truth. Was there anything else?
That's the question that came through. Thank you.
Alrighty, lovely. So let me just now. Sorry, Abuna, we're supposed to finish at 8:30. Is that right?
Oh no, Abuna, please keep going. We've got all the time. We've got as much time as what's okay as we want.
I don't think that's quite true. But okay, look, maybe I'll do another section. And the good news is we have another week to come back. So maybe I don't have to finish all the stuff I've got today. I can finish off next week. But let me just go through this section and then we'll see where we're going. Okay, so yes, so Jesus says to us, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. If the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed. And so you can see here, this is one of those verses in the Bible that is identifying God with truth, because the truth sets us free, the Son sets us free. And I think we're meant to understand from that the truth equals the Son. And notice how the truth has this effect of setting us free. And I think it really does do that. So what is the kind of state of play? I think we need to just say a couple of things. The first one is, nobody has settled the question of, does God exist, beyond any doubt whatsoever. So I don't think there's anyone in the world who would argue that 2 + 2 = 4. We do not have any kind of argument either for or against the existence of God that reaches anything like that level of confidence of 2 + 2 = 4. It is an open question. And that's why, there are still so many people in the world who have different views about this. But there are some things which I think we can establish pretty much beyond question. One of them is that Christianity makes sense, that it is rational. So even if you don't believe that Christianity is true, I really don't think you can argue that Christianity is absurd, that it makes no sense. Another thing that I think can be established beyond question is that there are an awful lot of extremely intelligent Christians. So, accusations like Richard Dawkins' thing, the God delusion, suggesting that, Christians have some kind of mental illness, or accusations that Christians are just stupid and that's why they still believe. And it's the enlightened, intelligent people who become atheists. But look, the fact is that there are stupid Christians and there are incredibly intelligent Christians. And there are stupid atheists and there are incredibly intelligent atheists as well. Why is this so? And it's worth stopping just for a minute, I think, to ask the question of, how do we come to believe what we believe? And again, a lot of the atheists that I've talked to, believe that what they are doing is something like mathematics. They believe that they are just being utterly cold and objective and sensible and logical about things. But once again, if you dive into the literature of the psychology of belief, you will find that that's actually almost never true. It's the exception rather than the rule, that any of us are just like, computer logical kind of things, right? We're not like that. We are living, breathing, warm-blooded human beings. And an awful lot of the reasons that we come to the beliefs that we have, whether that is atheism or Christianity or any religion or no religion, a lot of the reasons why we come there are subconscious and are not logical reasons. They're social reasons, they're emotional reasons, they're psychological reasons. They're not logical. It's not like mathematics. The example I've got on the screen there is one of my favorite studies where they found that judges trying court cases, on average, have a 60% favorable finding towards the plaintiff in the first case of the morning. And as the day wears on, the number of favorable findings gradually decreases until the last case before lunch. Guess what the favorable rate is for that case? It's actually 0. And then for the first case after lunch, it goes back up over to 60%. Now, that can't be because, more guilty people have their cases come before the judge before lunch than do at the beginning of the day or after lunch. That can't be the reason. The reason is the judges are getting tired, they're getting hungry, they're getting cranky, they're losing their patience. And all of those are subconscious things going on. Even in a scenario, a case where we would think, judges, they train themselves to be very logical. They are just there to apply the law. And they're doing that in a very sort of, mechanical, logical way. Actually, no, they're not. So when an atheist says to me, you guys are, you just believe all these myths, but I'm actually, I don't believe because I'm reasonable and I'm logical. I tell them you need to read some things if that's what you think you're doing, because the reality is that all of us, we're not as logical as we think that we are. Now, that doesn't mean that we can therefore not trust any of our beliefs, right? I believe that people sort of redid the study that I described after it had been published, and the results started to change. And my suspicion is judges heard about the study and they started taking note of what their thought processes in this aspect, and they started to sort of change what they do. It is certainly possible to be aware of our biases and to try and compensate for them. And again, that's a skill, that's an art that we have to try to learn to do. But having said all of that, one of the things we can do then is to look at some very logical arguments and ask ourselves, does this make sense? As objectively as we can, being aware of our biases. And one of the ways that I do that is I have discussed these kinds of arguments with atheists. I've looked for the cleverest atheists I could possibly find, at least the ones who would talk to me. And I have tried to have open discussions with them and push the discussions as far as I can. And that's how I try and overcome my own biases. And here is that one argument that I have never yet come across anyone who has given me a better answer to this question than God exists, and something like the God that we think of in Christianity. And it's a very simple argument. It simply asks the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does anything at all exist? We know absolutely everything we have ever observed in this universe has always had a cause. It is one of the ironclad laws of this universe that nothing happens without a cause. Where then does the universe itself come from? What causes the universe? if we think that the universe began with the Big Bang, what comes before the Big Bang? And notice this is not a question we're going to be able to answer with science, because I'm not a physicist, but from the little that I understand, apparently as you go back in time and get closer and closer to the Big Bang, there comes a point, a tiny fraction of a second after the Big Bang, where all the laws of physics break down. The equations don't work anymore. So we can't actually use them to explain how the universe began. We can't use the laws of the universe to explain the laws of the universe, right? That's a bad circular argument. The laws of the universe can't explain themselves. You need something beyond. You need something outside of the universe. You need something which, because it's outside of the universe, does not necessarily have to have the law of causation apply to it. We can only say everything in the universe has to have a cause because everything we've ever observed in the universe has had a cause. But once you are talking about something outside the universe, well, all bets are off. Now we don't know anything about that. Anything could go there. And whatever is out there, whatever is the thing that is beyond the universe and is uncaused itself and causes the universe, as Thomas Aquinas would say, that is what we call God. Okay, so in other words, the very fact that anything exists at all, there seems to be only one explanation for that. And that is there must be something very much like the God that we as Christians believe in. And the strange thing is there simply seems to be no other possible answer to that. If you say the universe is eternal, well, simply removing the time dimension doesn't answer this question. Why does time itself exist rather than nothing, rather than no time at all? Something has to have caused time, even if the universe had no beginning. If you say, oh, there's a multiverse, there's an infinite number of universes, beyond our own universe, that still doesn't answer the question, because a universe is something that needs to be explained, and an infinity of universes is an even bigger something that still needs to be explained. So there seems to be no logical or scientific way to find any other answer to this question other than God. The only way around it would be to say nothing exists, because if nothing exists, then there's no need to say that God exists. There's no evidence that he did anything. He may not exist. But I don't think anyone would argue that nothing exists. I think that's something that both the Christian and the atheist can agree on, that something exists. And once you accept that something exists, ultimately you need an answer for why. And God seems to be the only game in town, the only possible answer. I had a few other arguments there, but because of the time constraints, I think that's possibly where I might stop, if that's okay. And because I really, Zoom fatigue is a real thing. I'm convinced of it. And I don't want to tire you guys out. So maybe we might stop there, and I'm happy to talk for as long as you guys have the energy. So if you guys would like to raise any other issues or have any further chats, please do. And I believe young Samuel is with us here today as well. So I'll happily pass on some questions to him too, if he is willing to show himself. I'm not sure if he is. Yeah, there he is. He's still here. Okay. Yeah, Jackie, go for it.
Hi, Abuna. Thank you so much so far tonight. It's actually been good to consolidate some of these things that we sometimes don't think about, but we infuse and feel. But it's nice to get that. One of the questions that sort of remains a little bit with me, and I've come to the conclusion, but I know Otsak will have something a bit more sophisticated, is that if someone's just not being open-minded, there's absolutely going to be an argument, even if it goes against logic. But one of the big arguments that people come back with is the Bible's all made up. It's just stories. It's not real. Now, if we study theology and we look at what the church teaches, we know that the Bible is a result of multiple books that have been tested through the Holy Spirit and through God's grace to withstand the correct books. And so we can believe that they are God's words. But if you don't believe that, then the Bible is a bunch of stories. And, they often use the argument, oh, it's different versions. And, you can say, well, hang on, when there's three of us looking, we're all highlighting different aspects that stood out to us. It doesn't make those three aspects wrong. But it seems to kind of come back to, we don't believe it. It's made up. And for someone to not believe in God and the Holy Spirit, you can't then explain the reason that we believe in the Bible is we believe he's given it to us, and these are the books that have withstood. What are your thoughts and sort of conversations that you're able to have around that?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. And look, I totally agree with you that our pre-assumptions going into a discussion have a very big effect. Like I was saying, right, we are biased. And, we can both read the same thing, but if I come in with certain pre-assumptions and you come in with the opposite pre-assumptions, there's a very good chance that we'll end up coming to opposite conclusions as well. And it has nothing to do with the strength of the argument or the value of the words of the Bible or any of that sort of stuff. Look, I would say, yeah, I think in a sense, what we're now talking about is something more on a relational level. I think I really like the Bible because I feel it is the medium of a relationship for me with God. And I can certainly see how someone who doesn't have even the slightest inklings of such a relationship would find it hard to see the Bible the way that I see it. So I think one of the first things I would say to the person is, look, I understand where you're coming from. I understand why you think that way. And that makes sense to me that you should think that way. But let's have a look, right? Let's try and put our biases aside as much as we can and just take the Bible on its own merits, okay? And there's a whole lot of questions we could argue here. It's sometimes helpful to point out that Christians don't think of their Bible the way that Muslims think of their Quran. Because a lot of people, atheists and Christians, have a very Quranic view of the Bible. The Bible just dropped out of heaven. Okay, God dictated it, and Jesus gave out signed versions of the New King James Version to his disciples when he sent them out, to preach. And of course, that's not what the story is at all. The Bible was written over a very long period of time by very different people in very different cultures, and it came about by cooperation between the human and the divine. So the character of the human author, the social context, even sometimes the biases, and even sometimes the faults and the sins of the human author are reflected in the Bible. But that doesn't stop it from being the inspired word of God in human language. So the truth that is at the heart of the Bible is eternal and unchanging. And I think, anyone who actually gives it a chance will see the truth that is there in the words of the Bible. That's one thing, right? The question of when was it written? Did people make stories up? And, was it transmitted faithfully? And why are there so many different versions? They are all peripheral questions in a sense. And there are answers to those questions, by the way. I'm not saying that there aren't. As a very simple example, why are there so many different versions of the Bible? Well, actually, there is only one text of the Bible. And it's in Hebrew for the Old Testament, and it's in Greek for the New Testament. And we have had it ever since they were written, because they were written in those languages. And we have really good historical evidence that they were transmitted very, very, very faithfully. Things like the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which confirmed many of the texts of the Old Testament. Okay, what we have is a lot of different translations. So if you want to know what the Bible really says, right, learn a bit of Greek, learn a bit of Hebrew, or get an app. Nowadays you can get an app where you just tap on the word and it tells you all of the nuances and the different meanings of the original Greek word or the Hebrew word. Get a commentary, read what a scholar who has spent his life studying the languages, and so on, and understand from them what the language is actually saying. It's actually there, right? So that's a peripheral issue though, right? That's almost a kind of an excuse. What I really want to say to this person is, okay, let's read the Sermon on the Mount together. What do you think of this? Does this make sense to you? Does this ring true to you? And please don't look in it for, I want to know about lilies of the field and their biology and the chemical processes of photosynthesis that go on in their leaves. Okay, I'm sorry, you're not going to find that in the Sermon on the Mount. All right, that's again a kind of a modern prejudice that we have, that truth equals facts, truth equals information. But in fact, the most important truths are not facts or information. They are meaning, they are experience, they are relationships. And that's what we find. God could very easily have started, the first verse in the book of Genesis could have been, in the beginning, E equals MC squared, right? He could very easily have done that. But that's not the important thing that we need to know about the world that we live in and about our own lives. What we need to know is who we are and what is our place in this world within the context of the Creator who loved us and created us out of his love. And that's what we go to the Bible for, right? That's the kind of truth. When people say, oh, the Bible isn't true. Well, first, let's look at that kind of truth and see if it's in there. Because I suspect, Jackie, that if someone comes around to seeing that kind of truth in the Bible, they won't care very much about all those other questions that you were talking about, right? Because, who cares? It has nothing to do with anything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Abuna.
Sure. So anything else? Okay, so can I ask you before we finish up, so for next week, are there any specific topics or questions that you'd like to go over? Emil raised one or two today, and Jackie raised something really interesting as well. Are there? And look, you don't need to tell me now. You have Father Michael as a captive audience for you there. I'm sure you can grab him anytime and let him know, and he can pass it on.
Hi, Abuna.
Hello.
Could you please talk about pain? Because everyone now is saying it's not a fair God. The world we live in, people dying, wars, famine, all of these things.
Yeah, that's probably one of the hardest questions, I think, to answer in the whole field of apologetics. Look, would you like to make that the topic for next week? Because it will need it's not an easy one to answer, I don't think. Are enough people interested in that? Just give me a nod or a thumbs up or something like that.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Abuna, does that sound okay? Oh, Abuna's got his thumbs up too.
Yeah, I wanted to say that, but I didn't want to intrude. So Sylvia said it beautifully.
No, it's good. I will say just very briefly, though, since God sent me this opportunity, that this is one of my answers to the problem of pain. This is Arthur. And Arthur is a very loving, very warm, very cuddly dog who can't let me give a talk without coming up to help me. He insisted on jumping up. He refused to take no for an answer because he cares about the ministry that I do. And I'm only half joking. I use Arthur as an example of all that is good in the world. And I think the problem of suffering and the problem of pain is a very, very real one. But the one thing I will say today, and we'll talk more next week, is that if you did a survey of how many good things there are in the world and how many evil things there are in the world, I reckon it's no less than 1,000 to 1. The good outweighs the evil by a long, long way. But again, you know, our psychology is built in such a way that we notice the bad because that helps to keep us safe, right? If you're walking in the forest and you see, doesn't have to be the forest, if you're walking down the street and you see 100 beautiful roses, but you see one wasp, you know, that's buzzing near your face, you forget the 100 roses and all your attention, your whole world becomes composed of the wasp. and that's a good thing, right? That keeps us safe. But then when we think of our lives, sometimes we forget the 100 roses and all we can see is the wasp. But that's not really an answer to the question. We'll hopefully say more next week then on that topic. Emil, yeah, you wanted to say something.
Sorry, I just asking too many questions. Is any chance that you can give us an answer about when we get asked about the God in the Old Testament?
Oh, that would be another very big topic as well. But let's see how we go, shall we? Yeah, look, let's go with the problem of evil for next week, and then we'll see. Maybe we could schedule another session at some time and talk about the Old Testament.
Thank you, Will.
There's also someone aboard in the chat who's asking if it fits in with next week's discussion, if we could discuss how to speak about Christianity to someone of a different faith without offending them.
Sure. Yeah. No, we could certainly do that. That was the last section of the talk today, so I'll just hold that over for next week. Maybe we could even start with that next week.
Also got, I'll stop the recording for this question.